It is April 25th, 2025, and we are rounding out the news week with a transcript from the interview that President Trump did with Time magazine, looking back at the first nearly 100 days in his second term in office. He had some interesting things to say, specifically about Russia, China, and Iran, and the conflict surrounding those three countries. As we've been covering all week long, the US is actively at war with the multipolar world. So we're going to be looking at what Trump had to say versus what's actually happening on the ground and what the other countries involved are saying, because we're already getting some responses. And in the case of China, they're saying, hey, Trump is flat out wrong about the claims that he's making about Beijing reaching out to him. We're going to be discussing all of the latest there. But before we do, just a quick reminder that we are now less than 700 subscribers away from hitting 100,000 on YouTube. So if you're watching this video on YouTube, please make sure that you're subscribed. And also, your support makes my work possible. So you can sign up at any time if you're interested as a paid monthly subscriber over on my pages on Patreon and Substack. That'll give you access to exclusive content. You can also send a one-time donation at any time on Buy Me a Coffee. I'll leave all of the links in the description below. Now let's get into what Trump had to say in this interview with Time magazine. Now I will note that they say at the beginning of it that there are two different reporters, two different people conducting this interview. The transcript doesn't specify who said what, so I'll just be referring to it as the Time magazine interviewer and what they had to say, and then of course referring to Trump's responses. And I'll specifically be talking about where they mentioned foreign policy related topics here. So they did say a lot. You're welcome to go read it. I'll leave the link below, but I'll be focusing on the foreign policy related topics that I typically cover here on this channel. And I will start with what Trump had to say about China, and more specifically about Chinese President Xi Jinping. Because as we've seen in the last few weeks, the US and China have escalated the ongoing trade war between the two countries to unprecedented levels, right? We're talking about 145% tariffs that Trump is threatening, implementing. I don't even know what's going on against China, right? One minute it's 145% tariffs, the next minute it's exemptions, at least temporarily, for smartphones and other electronics. So a lot going on here. It still seems to change by the day. But Trump was specifically asked by the interviewer if he would call President Xi if Xi does not call him. And to that, Trump said no. The interviewer said, "You won't." Trump said, "Nope." "Has he called you yet?" "Yep." "Did he? When did he call you?" "He's called, and I don't think that's a sign of weakness on his behalf." Okay, so you have Trump on record there claiming that the president of China called him. Well, we have yet to see any evidence of that. And we also, looking at what Chinese officials have said, they have said that that absolutely did not happen. In fact, if you look at the reports that were coming out this week, a spokesman for China's Commerce Ministry said on Thursday that there were no economic and trade negotiations between China and the United States, and that any claims about progress in China-US economic and trade negotiations are baseless rumors without factual evidence. Now, if you're looking at this and thinking, okay, it's one thing to have official trade negotiations, but what is the possibility that Xi Jinping picked up the phone and called Donald Trump? Oh, well, a report from the Associated Press gives an answer to that, as they noted that only once in recent history has a Chinese leader phoned the United States without invitation after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So Trump claims that Xi picked up the phone and called him, but then when pressed on it, when asked for more details, he refuses to give any. And that does not surprise me, because it does not seem like the president of China has picked up the phone and called Donald Trump, at least from what we've seen so far, and especially with the ongoing tensions, with the ways in which China has continued to retaliate at every step and has not backed down. I'm not exactly expecting Xi to pick up the phone and call Trump and try to beg for any kind of deal to be worked out here. And of course, if you're going to talk to Trump about anything, you may as well include a few questions about the ongoing war in Ukraine, seeing as how that is one of the biggest foreign policy topics happening right now. And that is exactly what these interviewers did. I have a few comments I'll add about the ways in which they phrased their questions because they clearly were not serious questions, but let's get into it. The interviewer notes that Trump said he would end the war in Ukraine on day one. Trump responds, "Well, I said that figuratively, and I said that as an exaggeration because to make a point, and it gets, of course, by the fake news." Not sure what he said after that. Then he says, "Obviously, people know that when I said it, it was said in jest, but it was also said that it will be ended." The interviewer says, "Well, what's taking so long? When do you think it will be ended?" Trump says, "Well, I don't think it's long. I mean, look, I got here 3 months ago. This war has been going on for 3 years. It's a war that would have never happened if I were president. It's Biden's war. It's not my war, yada, yada." This is what he says. "I would never have had that war, blah, blah, blah." And I say that because it's getting old listening to Trump say the same things over and over again, which is a lot of what we get when it comes to his foreign policy commentary. But this comment that this never would have happened. And I covered this in yesterday's video, kind of talking about the fact that, if Trump wants to argue that we would not have seen the same escalation in the same way, then sure, he can argue that. But that does not change the fact that his first term, his administration was the one actively helping Ukraine, sending them lethal aid, building up to a future war with Russia, right? They were doing nothing to stop Kiev from targeting what was at the time the Donbas republics, just like they're doing nothing to stop Kiev from fighting this war now. In fact, they're continuing to allow military aid to go to them. They're continuing to allow intelligence sharing with Ukraine's military. So because of that, Trump can't sit there and claim, "Oh, well, this would have never happened under me." Well, it's happening under you right now. And arguably, he still played a role in building up the tensions between the US and Russia. It's not like everything was fine between the two countries and then Biden came in and somehow ruined everything. Now, as for the question of peace, the interviewer at Time magazine says, "Do you think peace is still possible if Putin is president?" Trump says, "I think peace is possible." You say if Putin is still president. Yeah, if Putin is president, can there be peace if Putin is president of Russia? I think with me as president, there's possible, if very probable, if somebody else is president, no chance. If Putin can make peace, yeah, I think Putin will. I think Putin would rather do it a different way. I think he'd rather go and take the whole thing. And I think that because of me, I believe I'm the only one that can get this thing negotiated. And I think we're a long way. We've had very good talks and we're getting very close to a deal. And I don't believe anybody else would have made that deal. And this is another thing that we see a lot of from Trump, this kind of back and forth. Because I mean, this week alone, we've seen him, JD Vance, Marco Rubio all have this talk, this rhetoric about walking away from the war in Ukraine, saying we're just going to be done with it. So it is interesting to see him saying, "Oh, now we're going to have a deal." Right now, we're seeing progress to it. Maybe that's because his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, met with Russian President Putin again earlier today, is now fourth meeting, I believe. And so maybe he's looking at that, and now that's giving Trump a new view on the situation, I suppose. But it is kind of exhausting to watch this yo-yo rhetoric going back and forth when, again, the US is still actively enabling this war and arguably making it possible. If the US withdrew support entirely tomorrow, we would not see the same situation in Kiev because Europe would not be able to provide the same support that the US has been and continues to do. Then the interviewer asked, "Do you believe peace is possible if Zelensky is still president of Ukraine?" Trump says, "Yeah, I do. He is president now, and I think we're going to make a deal." "Should Ukraine give up any hope of ever joining NATO?" Trump says, "I don't think they'll ever be able to join NATO. I think that's been from day one. I think I think what caused the war to start was when they started talking about joining NATO. If that weren't brought up, there would have been a much better chance that it wouldn't have started. Now, of course, what Trump doesn't say is that it's not just like Ukraine had NATO ambitions and Russia said, all right, let's go to war. It's that NATO, the US, they were actively encouraging those ambitions, if not driving them forward, right? Being in a position where in the post 2014 era, after you had the US and Western backed coup in Ukraine, you had the West in this position where that was what it was all about, right? We got rid of the democratically elected government. The Ukrainian people allowed for this now anti-Russian regime to come in and to take control. And because of that, they were promised NATO membership. They were promised EU membership. It's not as if Zelensky or even any of these violent neo-Nazis just decided one day that they wanted to join NATO and Russia had a problem with that. It's that they were actively encouraged in their ambitions. They were told that this is the direction that you were headed and you just do XYZ, right? You just continue on with these current tensions. You deny any ties to Russia, even though that is your history. And one of these days, you are going to be a member of NATO or a member of the European Union or whatever else was included in Victoria Nuland's little speech and her ongoing promises to Kiev. And then they talk about Crimea. And this is where I personally take issue with the way in which this question was phrased, because the interviewer from Time magazine says, should Crimea go to the Russians? Should they get to keep Crimea? Trump says, well, Crimea went to the Russians. It was handed to them by Barack Hussein Obama and not by me. With that being said, will they be able to get it back? They've had their Russians, they've had their submarines there for long before any period that we're talking about for many years. The people speak largely Russian in Crimea, but this was given by Obama. This wasn't given by Trump. Would it have been taken from me like it was taken from Obama? No, it wouldn't have happened. Crimea, if I were president, would not have been taken. And it's interesting because with his phrasing there, you would think that Ukraine was a state. You would think that it was actively part of the US, with him saying, oh, it was handed over by Obama. Now, if he wants to blame the Obama administration for the 2014 coup, which was what led the Crimean people to decide that they were going to return to Russia in a referendum in which they overwhelmingly supported returning to Russia. Well, I guess you can make that argument, but his language there, as a reminder, it is still enforcing this idea that Russia, quote unquote, took Crimea when there never was a battle for Crimea to begin with. And I love the way that the interviewer phrased this. I'm being sarcastic about that because when they say something like, oh, should the US just allow Russia to keep Crimea? Okay, what is the US going to do? No, seriously. You look at all the thousands of sanctions. Russia is the most sanctioned nation in the world. The US is actively engaged in a proxy war against Russia. They have armed Kiev to the teeth as much as they can. They have killed as many Russians as they can, short of going to World War III and shooting off nuclear bombs. Okay, well, then what are you going to do to get Crimea back under Kiev's control? What are you going to do to force the people of Crimea to be back under the control of a regime that wants nothing to do with them because they are Russian at the end of the day? Are you going to start World War III over Crimea in order to try to get it back under Kiev's control? That doesn't exactly sound logical, does it? I do think that Trump understands at least that part of it, even if he doesn't fully get it, or even if he's phrasing it in a way that is so mainstream specific here in the US that it's a reminder that he is continuing to do the bidding of the US establishment. However, it's also a reminder that the interviewers at Time magazine are phrasing this question in such a way that we saw this version of it during the presidential debates when they asked Donald Trump, well, don't you want Ukraine to win? And that's a trick question because there is no victory for Ukraine right now. We have to remember, even if Russia turned around, they won't, but even if they turned around tomorrow and they said, you know what, you're right, we're going to give you all of the Donbass and we're going to remove all troops and rescind all claims to this land as a result of those 2022 referendums, blah, blah, blah. That's not a victory for Ukraine. That's not a victory for the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people who have been forced to fight and die in this war for Western imperialism, for the US and its ongoing bid to do everything possible to try to weaken Russia. That's not a victory. There is no win for Ukraine here. The US may see additional land grabs as a victory, which is why we're seeing Ukraine and Kiev in particular try to carry out additional incursions into Russian land because they seem to think that this is some sort of a victory. But at the end of the day, there is no actual victory for the Ukrainian people. Now, as for the topic of the Palestinian people and the US support for Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, the interviewer said, UNICEF says that more than 300 children have been killed and more than 600 have been wounded since the ceasefire in Gaza broke down. Who is to blame for those deaths? Trump said, I would say that the blame for that is Biden more than anybody else because as you know, Iran was broke and he allowed them to become rich. The interviewer said more than Hamas. Trump said there was no money for Hamas. There was no money for Hezbollah. There was no money. Iran was broke under Trump. And you know that he knows that broke. Now watch the way that this is phrased here, because what this interviewer is doing is they are setting it up for Trump. They're saying, hey, 300 children have been killed. We don't know by whom, but who do you blame? And he's giving Trump, he or she, whoever's asking this question, is giving Trump the opportunity to step in here and to say, I blame Hamas, right? Hamas screwed up the ceasefire deal, blah, blah, blah. It's all their fault. This war is all happening because of them. This isn't genocide. This isn't Israel trying to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. No, don't pay attention to that. This is Hamas. But Trump doesn't do that. Instead, he takes this and he tries to make it about Iran. But I believe when they're talking about 300 children being killed, Trump knows exactly who is being killed here. He knows exactly who is being targeted, and he knows that U.S. weapons are being used in those attacks, in those war crimes that are being carried out and are continuing to be carried out by Israel with the help and support of the US. And then Trump wants to talk about, oh, Iran was broke under the US. They couldn't support Hamas or Hezbollah. Interesting there. He does not mention it, and the interviewer certainly does not follow up to, ask about Israel's support. Netanyahu's support in particular for Hamas in the past. Netanyahu, who specifically ignored warnings of an October 7th attack before it happened. None of that is, of course, mentioned, and then they just move quickly on. But I did want to highlight that because the Palestinian people are continuing to be targeted by Israel in a genocide. The killings are horrific. They're happening on a daily basis. And now you're seeing these warnings, the humanitarian aid, that what was in Gaza is running out, that the humanitarian crisis is more dire than ever before. And clearly, Trump doesn't care about that. Clearly, when he's asked a single question about that, even a very easy softball question, he refuses to answer it because that's how little he cares about the Palestinian people. And then they got to the topic of Iran, with the interviewer saying, you reportedly stopped Israel from attacking Iran's nuclear sites. Trump says, that's not right. The interviewer says, it's not right. Trump says, no, it's not right. I didn't stop them, but I didn't make it comfortable for them because I think we can make a deal without the attack. I hope we can. It's possible we'll have to attack because Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, but I didn't make it comfortable for them. But I didn't say no. Ultimately, I was going to leave that choice to them, but I said I would much prefer a deal than bombs being dropped. The interviewer asked, are you worried Netanyahu will drag you into a war? Trump says no. The interviewer says, let's talk about some of the issues with universities. Then Trump goes right back to saying, by the way, he may go into a war, but we're not getting dragged in. The U.S. will stay out of it if Israel goes into it. Trump says, the U.S. will stay out of it if Israel goes into it, the interviewer asked. "No, I didn't say that," Trump responds. "You asked if he dragged me in, like I'd go in unwillingly. No, I may go in very willingly if we can't get a deal. If we don't make a deal, I'll be leading the pack." Okay, so here we have Trump now downplaying this report that we got last week from the New York Times, saying that Trump specifically told Netanyahu no, or at the very least, not yet, in response to the plans that Israel was putting together for an attack on Iran that would have to have US support, right? There is no Israeli attack without the US. We need to make that very clear here. There is no Israel acting alone. No, the US is there the entire way, supplying the bombs, supplying the help along the way, supplying the air defense when Iran inevitably retaliates to Israel's would-be attack. And the US is also supplying the public and political support along the way, just as they have with this entire ongoing genocide against the Palestinians. So it's interesting to watch the way that Trump is handling this question, because there are still very legitimate concerns. As we've been following this week, there have been reports that Israel is planning a quote unquote solo attack. Now, as I just noted, there is no such thing as a solo attack. There is such a thing as the US acting like they're not involved, right? Acting like this is Israel's attack, trying to build up plausible deniability. Like the US is actively in these talks with Iran. They want to work out a nuclear deal with Iran. They've presented Iran with the deal of the century. Oh, and then what happens when Israel goes and carries out that attack anyway? And then the US just happens to quietly continue to provide support behind the scenes. And this is why I think it's so important to continue to follow, yes, the statements that Trump is making, right? What he has to say, whether it's about Ukraine, Russia, Iran, Israel, China, this ongoing trade war, those statements that he's making, it's important to pay attention to what he's saying versus what the US is actually doing. Because as we're seeing right now, the US is actually continuing to support this ongoing proxy war against Russia. They're actually continuing to beat the war drums against Iran, to provide support for Israel in both its genocide and whatever it's planning for a future attack on Iran. The US is actually pursuing a future war with China and planning for it. We're seeing all of this as it's being reported happening behind the scenes, yes, but also happening right before our eyes. And it doesn't matter what Trump says about, oh, we talked here, or we're going to do this, or oh, Xi Jinping called me on the phone. These claims that he's making, they do not change the trajectory of US foreign policy. And so as we continue to pay attention to what he's saying and the different comments that he makes, it's more important than ever to pay attention to what the US is actually doing and pursuing. And that's something everyone should be talking about. If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.